Mr. Ambassador, thank you for this exclusive interview for our new podcast. It's called Follow Up. I was going to start with Greece and East Med and Turkey, but there's a huge story emerging today about a new book that claims that the KGB began grooming Donald Trump 40 years ago by saving him from financial ruin. I want to hear your reactions to this story.
Well, I hadn't heard about the book, but I'm sure it'll be a bestseller, whether it's true or not. And one of the arguments that Trump made over and over again in response to allegations about he and his campaign colluding with the Russians was there's no evidence of it. And Robert Mueller conducted a long investigation, and he basically couldn't find any evidence of it. So if we now have a claim that 40 years ago the Russians, Soviets as they were then, created a sleeper agent, it's a fascinating story. Let's see what the evidence is.
Well, you've been very close to Trump, and you've talked in your book a lot about this connection and these dealings that Mr. Trump had with Mr. Putin. What's your feeling about this?
Well, to be undercover for 40 yees for the KGB or even for the CIA requires somebody to be very disciplined, very tight with what he says, so as not to reveal anything about the linkage. Both of those things are hard, if not impossible, for Donald Trump to do. He's not somebody I would recruit to send on a secret mission for anything because he couldn't stop telling people about it. So it's a daring hypothesis, and maybe it's actually a novel rather than a documentary book, but I guess we'll see.
Let me get back to Greece, Mr. Ambassador, and the East Med. Antony Blinken, a long-time aide of Mr. Biden and very familiar with many aides of the Greek government and many diplomats for many years, has been sworn as Secretary of State. How do you think Mr. Blinken will handle Turkey's aggression? I heard him say to Mr. Menendez a few days ago that Turkey doesn't act as an ally should. How do you think Mr. Blinken will handle Turkey?
Well, I saw that answer in the confirmation hearing as well, and I think that's exactly right. The point that I would make, I believe, is that Turkey and Erdogan are two different things, or at least that's what I hope. Erdogan is not a good NATO ally. As to that, there's no question. A good NATO ally would not have bought the S-400 air defense system from Russia. An ally would not be of a secular Turkey, of the Kemal Ataturk constitution, would not be pursuing Islamicist aspirations throughout the Middle East, wouldn't be allied with the Muslim Brotherhood, wouldn't be contributing to a civil war in Libya, wouldn't be so hostile to Israel. I am hoping, and I admit it's a hope, I can't document this, but I hope that in the 2023 presidential elections in Turkey that Erdogan is defeated. I think he is weaker internally than he would like to think. We know from local and city elections there in the past couple of years. So it could be that what Blinken and Biden are doing is trying to make it clear inside Turkey that Erdogan is the problem. I'm not saying that if Erdogan were replaced by a different president that everything would be sweetness and light in the Eastern Mediterranean or between Greece and Turkey. I'm not saying that either. But I will guarantee you that as long as Erdogan is in power, that the troubles will get worse and the risks and instability in the Eastern Mediterranean will increase.
I understand. I've heard Mr. Biden in this famous interview with the New York Times talking about Mr. Erdogan, and his words echo your words about a change perhaps in leadership in Turkey and how Mr. Erdogan acts all these years. But Mr. Biden is now the president, and Turkey, I understand, it's a huge headache for the US in this part of the world. Many people are worried that now Mr. Biden will try to pull Turkey again close to the US, away from Russia, and that might change the strategy, and perhaps it could sacrifice strategic interests of a NATO ally, Greece?
Well, I think, and certainly I've not spoken to Joe Biden about this, so I'm just speculating from what I know and what I've seen. I think it's pretty clear that Biden's personal relationship with Erdogan is not close, and that they've exchanged sharp words in private. I'm sure it was done very professionally, but it's pretty clear that they do not have the kind of bromance that Trump and Erdogan had. So we start from a different perspective there. And I think the fact that by the end of the Trump administration, finally, long after it should have been done, that U.S. sanctions were imposed on Turkey for the purchase of the S-400 means that Erdogan is in a much more difficult position vis-a-vis Biden than he was with Trump. And we know for a fact that the Turkish economy continues to suffer. The value of the currency remains under threat. So I would say at this point, Erdogan has a weak hand, but he's a complicating factor, not only because of the dealings with Russia, but because of the troublemaking in Syria, the troublemaking in Libya, the adverse relationship with Israel at a time when other Muslim countries, the Gulf Arabs and others, are beginning to recognize Israel. So I think Erdogan's in a very difficult position, and my recommendation to Biden, if he were to ask for it, would be don't concede anything to Erdogan at this point. You don't need to pull him in. Erdogan needs to find a way to make up for his past mistakes in order to get back into a close relationship with the U.S.
Yeah, many people think that Mr. Erdogan only understands power. I remember very clearly the Branson case and how he reacted to that U.S. policy. These last few days, Greece just acquired a squadron of French Rafale planes, high-end military planes. And there are also some reports, Mr. Ambassador, that Greece is in talks and wants to acquire the F-35. Well, there's a big story behind the Turks and the F-35. Do you believe that Greece should be given the F-35 plane?
Yeah, there's no question about it. And it's too bad you bought the Rafales. The F-35 is really a much better plane, as I think the Greek Air Force will find out if they buy them. Look, I was involved in the decision to cut Turkey's purchase of 100 F-35s because they had bought the S-400 air defense system. So that was a major element of the F-35 program that we couldn't accept. You can't have the F-35 in effect surveilled by S-400 radar without compromising the stealth, essential stealth aspects of the plane. And it was one of the reasons it was simply inexplicable that Turkey could buy the S-400 and expect to be a NATO ally in good standing, number one. But number two, Turkey was also a major part of the supply chain for the F-35. This was part of the plan to make it fully international. And I think we filed that under the category of it seemed like a good idea at the time. But we need to disentangle from that supply chain so as not to be dependent on Turkey if they're going to continue to perform in the fashion that they have under Erdogan. So this is a major turning point for Turkey because American aerospace and defense companies and many others will not look with favor at any further investment in Turkey or any further reliance in their supply chains for whatever the product may be on things coming out of Turkey.
Well, an acquisition of the F-35 by Greece perhaps would change also the equilibrium of power in the East Med. Would you be in favor of that?
Yeah, look, if Turkey were a good NATO ally, Greece acquiring the F-35 would strengthen the alliance as a whole, and I think that's one very good reason to do it. It's Greece, Israel, with the F-35 is a powerful combination. The Eastern Mediterranean is, if I had to pick a region of the world that's not receiving enough attention for possible economic development over the years, that's what I would pick. I mean, you've seen now with Bahrain, the UAE, I think other Gulf Arab countries exchanging diplomatic relations with Israel. They've got enormous capital. The linkages of oil and gas from the Israeli fields in the Eastern Mediterranean into Europe, the economic potential is enormous. So Turkey can either choose to be a part of that, or it can pursue this bizarre neo-Ottoman design that I think Erdogan has. I don't think that's being paranoid. I think that's what he thinks, and he's been able to get away with this idea for a number of years. But I think he's coming to the end of the line. Although it will be Turkey's decision in 2023 whether they re-elect him.
I understand. Let me ask you, with Mr. Trump out of the picture, last time we talked for Alpha TV, you told me, and you were true, that now he will be sitting by his pool at Mar-a-Lago. Who is next for the Republicans? We've all seen Mike Pence moving very smartly, I think, for a few months, and he survived Mr. Trump, and also Mr. Pompeo. These are two names that come in my mind. Do you have in your mind the successor?
Well, I don't have a favored candidate myself. I'm a big fan of Mike Pence. I think he did a fantastic job as vice president under very difficult circumstances. But the Republican field in 2024 will be very crowded. Many senators running, governors running. It will be a very interesting race. Commentators, including commentators on the Democratic side, believe that Joe Biden might be a one-term president because of his age, if nothing else. So there could be very important contests for the nomination in both parties in 2024. But I think on the Republican side, it will be very competitive with a lot of people trying to get in at the beginning. The field narrows fairly quickly, typically, but I think a lot of people are going to take a look at it.
Are there any points that the Republicans and the Democrats can agree on now at the start of the Biden presidency? Perhaps in foreign affairs, that is your field. Could you say that in these 3 points we're on the same page?
Well, it's hard to say, because in the 2020 campaign, national security was not very much debated. Really, very little was debated. It was a referendum on Trump. That's what the Democrats wanted. That's what Trump wanted too, because then he could talk about himself. But as a practical matter, it meant that Joe Biden did not have to spell out his policies with great specificity, particularly in national security. So he has the luxury now, in a sense, of having more flexibility. I think in terms of dealing with Russia, that Biden's policies are likely to be closer to where the bulk of the Republican Party is than people might expect, with one huge exception, and that's dealing with strategic nuclear weapons and the fate of the New START treaty, where the Democratic impulse is to sign a new agreement, and where I think Republicans overwhelmingly will oppose it unless tactical nuclear weapons are included, and unless China, which is an emerging nuclear threat, is included. Biden will take a harder line against Israel. I think U.S.-Israeli relations have been extraordinarily good the past 4 years. I think they're about to get worse. But the big question is, for the U.S. really, is how to deal with China, which is the global existential threat in the 21st century. And I think that implicates Europe directly, because while this is not an ideological struggle against China, I don't view it as a Marxist country. I view it as an authoritarian country. That Europe's going to have to decide what its relationship with China is going to be. Chancellor Merkel seems to be very accommodating to China. I think that's a mistake. But this will be a discussion, I think, between the United States and Europe about how to deal not just with the continuing threat of Russia, but with the global threat of China.